If God promises, you can trust that promise. That's the story of Abraham. Hi, I'm Warren, director here at St. Columba's. Glad you could join me for my message of the day. On Sunday, we read from Genesis 12, the first few verses. It's a very succinct little story about God calling Abraham and Sarah to leave where they are and go into the land that God would show them. And Abraham believed and went. And God promises, and if you were to read those few verses, it's not a conditional promise. It's not saying, if you do the right thing, Abraham, I will. It's just a promise. I will bless you, Abraham. You will be a blessing. And actually through you, all the families of the world would be blessed. It's a beautiful little story, about 4 verses. It's worth reading. But just those few little verses, a great deal is made of it in the New Testament. So to follow on from our first reading last Sunday, we read from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, and verses 13 to 17, where he talks about Abraham and the promise, and Abraham's faith. I'd like you just to take a moment just to go and read that passage. So it's Romans 4, 1 to 5, and then verses 13 to 17. Just take a moment to do that. Push the pause button, then come on back. Well, welcome back. Thanks for returning, and I hope you had a chance to read that passage. It's a beautiful little passage, and as I said, the original Genesis story had 4 verses, and Paul makes a lot of this. It's quite dense. But at its heart, Paul is recognizing the great act of faith and trust that Abraham showed in the promise of God. Of course, it's not just Abraham's faith. You need a promise from God, and Abraham has faith in the promise. So it's not just about Abraham's faith, it's about God's promise. That's so important. But Abraham believes, and St. Paul makes a few arguments here. For instance, he says that this isn't about doing the right thing, the law. It's about God's promise and believing it. It's not a work, so to speak. It's faith. We can talk more about how those two interact, but it's not something we do. It's not like God made a conditional promise. If you do certain things, Abraham, I will. It's I am going to do this. And Abraham believes. So the promise rests on faith rests on the promise. So faith rests on grace because it was not a conditional promise. So it's graceful. It's full of God's love for all of us, starting with Abraham. And I talked a bit about that last Sunday, why God might do it that way. But that's the point. God promises this, Abraham to be blessed, will be a blessing, and all people will be blessed. Abraham believes in the promise and acts. And he goes off and wanders around. We read about that in the book of Genesis. And then Paul also says that because Abraham and Sarah are beyond childbearing age, that Abraham believed in the God that can call into existence the things that do not exist. What seems impossible, God can do. Now this, St. Paul here is going to use this as an analogy, so to speak, a way of understanding our faith in Jesus. That God brings from the dead someone who was rejected, executed, brings back from the dead, resurrects this Jesus. It brings into existence, so to speak, that which wasn't. And we are to trust. And next week I want to talk a little bit more about what we mean by this, because we shouldn't think that our faith in Jesus and what God has done in Jesus, the promise that he makes, and we looked at one of those promises last Sunday as well, John chapter 3 verse 16 onwards, for God so loved the world. It's a promise. We are to have faith in that promise. But what we have to make sure is, and this is what I'll talk about next week, is that faith, that act of faith, doesn't become a work. If I have faith, then God must. No, we're responding to God's promise, to God's grace. The grace is already ahead of us. We're catching it still. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.